So first of all, thank you everybody for coming and coming early. This is pretty crazy how this conference is set up. There were many people that came 20 minutes early and couldn't make it in. So our hope is you don't tell them what happened in here to just keep the intrigue and the price value of us talking super high. That's the only ask we have. Yeah. In sincerity, thank you very much. I'll introduce myself first, and we'll kind of jump into it and give you kind of a lay of the land of what we're planning to do. Some of you may have noticed I walked across a few of the tables when I thought the room was going to be empty 45 minutes ago. To hear a little bit about who's in the audience, we'll poll in a second to get a sense. ASU is this fascinating event where we get this broad gamut of folks that range from a primary K through 5 teacher, potentially through an ed tech, serial entrepreneur, or venture capitalist, or banker, or corporate learning officer. And it's hard to figure out how to build and do a talk that addresses all those different interests and all those different roles and responsibilities. But we'll do our best to keep this engaging, and we will leave as much time as possible for Q&A. So by way of introduction, my name is Eran Megiddo, and up until extremely recently, I led the education strategy efforts and product efforts at Microsoft. I've been at Microsoft for 21 years, after actually doing an ed tech startup way back in the 90s, ahead of its time, using neural networks in 96 and 97, when we were proud of being able to learn on 50 parameters, and we'll talk a little bit about what that looks like today. And then spent 20 years at Microsoft leading various products, such as Excel and PowerPoint, and products that many of you probably use, as well as Windows, but most recently led the education efforts, everything we do for K through 12 and higher ed. And the last role I had at Microsoft was as the CTO for the Windows and Devices group, and spent the last year thinking a lot about, obviously, Microsoft's relationship with OpenAI. What are we doing in the context of generative AI? So hopefully some of that experience, the time thinking about education, the time thinking about AI over the past many years, but generative AI over the past year plus, will bring shed some light into questions that you guys have in the room. So that's my background. As I said, until recently, I just literally announced, quite literally on LinkedIn today, but decided a few months ago to leave Microsoft after 21 years to go do a startup in this space, because I believe it is the right time to go do disruptive new things. So that is kind of where I am heading, but we will not spend time on that. Sourabh.
Hi, I'm Sourabh. I am one of the co-founders of Corise, and prior to that, I worked at Google Research, primarily on what led to these models being created. And before that, I was an early engineer at Coursera, so have been around education and AI most of my career. Really love that space and excited to share more about what we have learned and what we see, how we see the world. Yeah.
So we're going to essentially back and forth a little bit, conversation, questions and answers on a few things that we picked up, we thought ahead of time, and a few things that we picked up kind of from talking to you. But then also leave, as I said, room for questions. But I like framing at least what are the goals for the session. What are the, if we did an exit poll on the way out, what would you take away? And these takeaways might sound pretty straightforward, but I think that they are also important and kind of fundamental, and especially as I talk to folks, I think that they're relevant. And the first one is, if you aren't using generative AI to help you in your job every single day right now, then you should be. And that really, I can't impress that enough, and we'll talk about use cases and examples of people that don't think they should be, and now that they are, what does it look like? If you aren't using it literally every single day, you should be. That's takeaway number one. Takeaway number two is, if you think it's limited by all the various things you're reading about, or that you've tried and it's too simplistic, or it doesn't answer correctly, or it doesn't know how to do math, or it doesn't know how to do attribution, whatever limitation that you think is out there, I can tell you from having been involved in a lot of kind of the early work, and Sourabh even more than I can, the rate of progress on the technology right now is such that any limitation you think of right now is not going to be a limitation in months, maybe a year or two down the road, but it won't be. So don't plan what you're doing around the limitations that the technology might have today. That's takeaway number two. And takeaway number three, and this is where I think we're be great to engage in conversation as well, is if you stop and think about what's going to hold back the possibilities that generative AI and ChatGPT enable, it's going to be the systems, the process, the people, not the technology. It's going to be, we talked a lot on this table around the fear teachers have of it, or the fear parents have of it, or administration have it, fear of the unknown. It's going to be just continuing to do stuff the way we do stuff, because the day just disappears by just doing what we need to go do versus changing how we do it. That's what's going to hold it back. And the more each one of us and everybody in the room can take away from our session today and think about how you are a change agent into changing the processes and how people think about it, the more you will unlock what the possibilities and the benefits of the technology are. So we'll talk about all three of those. So I think maybe starting, Sourabh, since you have the technical background, the depth from your time at Google, working in the research division, a little bit of a primer just on what is new in this generative AI world.
Yeah, so I'm sure we've talked about AI for 20 years. And in general, what we used to call AI till a year or two ago was hey, I have a lot of data, I can recognize patterns in that. And you would see it every day. It would be the movie Netflix recommends you. It's your next YouTube video. It's how Uber predicts the price. And what was common in all of those problems was we knew what was possible. So Netflix knows what all movies are on the platform, so it's not recommending you a movie that is not on the platform. YouTube knows what movies or videos it has, or prices between certain ranges of dollar amounts. So we knew what to predict. What is different in generative AI is you're creating something brand new. So you can create a new image that has never been created before. So the possibility of the output is just much, much larger. So you can create an essay that was never done. You can create an answer that was never written before. And a lot of this started in 2018, where there's this seminal paper called Attention is All You Need, which introduces this model called the transformer, or what you call the large language model. So think of this as there's a black box, there's an input text coming in, there's an output text going out. And the first versions of this were text to text. So you could put a Spanish sentence in, you could get an English translation out, or vice versa. And how the model learns is, which is it sees on the internet there are websites that have been translated. So if you go to Amazon.com and then you go to the Spanish version of Amazon.com, you can match the same text this is the English version, this is the Spanish version. And it kind of picks up that pattern. And what it's inherently doing is it's looking at saying, hey, hi, how are you? If I give it that sentence, the very likely thing that comes at the end of that is a question mark. Or if I give that, the very next thing is I am fine. So what it's not actually memorizing anything. What it's learning is, given some input text, what is the most likely next word? And then it goes again, and most likely next word, and it goes again. And imagine if you did that 10 times, and then you said, oh, maybe I predicted it wrong here, let me try another branch. And that's how the model picks up. So it's not kind of copy pasting anything, it is just what it's learning is what is the likely next word given some word, and the core. And this is how these models were trained. And now if we imagine okay, this was good for text, how do we make it learn video? I've heard about images, how does that work? So an image is kind of just like text is a sequence of characters. Image is a sequence of dots. So it is inherently similar to a sequence of color pixels in your monitor. Or if you think of videos, it's a sequence of frames, and each frame has a sequence of pixels inside it. And audio is a sequence of frequencies that I'm that are coming out of my throat here. So that's why we can see the same technology or model be applied to I have an input sequence and I get an output sequence. And this was kind of breakthrough, because before that any new problem we encountered, we had to come up with a new system. But now we had built this general purpose system that could be hyper specialized in a lot of things. So think of the model as having foundational knowledge, and then as you pick a problem, you can hyper specialize the model to do certain problems. So what we see with the prompt is we give it an input sequence, we get an output sequence, but you could hyper specialize the model to a certain problem domain, say text to video. And then you would imagine that oh, I give it some narrative of a scene, it generates that scene for me. That's where we're at.
I think there's one thing that Sourabh talked about that I think is important. We talk a lot about generative AI and the fact that it can generate whatever the next word in the sequence, generate a whole essay or a video. The other breakthrough that is just as important and worth stopping to think about is the natural language processing and the understanding of what the intent the user has to begin with. It's based on the same underlying transformer model, but without the natural language understanding, the whole system and the whole GPT kind of era would not have happened. And it's a big, big difference than what we had before. And I'll give you a context, and we're going to switch into kind of use cases. I'll give you a context, the context of the natural language understanding in the context of systems of helping students. If I'm trying to help a student learn as a teacher, and there's educators across every table I stopped with, there's educators here. If I'm trying to help a student learn, one of the things I'm going to try to figure out is, okay, what do they already know? Right? Are they a visual learner or not a visual learner? How do they, what is their learning style? Are they currently, after a long day of sports and too tired to go learn or not learn? And try to pick up as much as possible in order to do my best explaining something to them, or maybe deciding not even to explain something to them. If you think about a user interface for that in software, no kid is going to go through 30 questions on a forum going, okay, what are your hobbies? How old are you? Do you already know this? Do you not know this? And that's just user interface that does not exist. So all the software out there today doesn't know all that about the student, right? It's not going to personalize in any way to a student in any, maybe they know what grade they're in, maybe they know it's algebra, and they know what lesson it is, but not much more than that around all the other context. And yet by simple conversation, because of the natural language understanding that these models have, a conversational user experience changes all that. Because by just asking a couple of questions, just like I would ask a student in front of me, I'm going to get the personalized, I'm going to pick up a ton that I did not need to go create user interface for. And that's a big change in how this gets deployed, and it opens up for a lot of use cases. And I like actually talking about the use cases that may be not, less common in the education system. And I'll give you an example. I was talking to an athletic director at a D3 college that my daughter actually plays basketball at. And we were talking literally about the basketball team and the athletics department and how things are going. And I was like, are you using ChatGPT? He's like, oh, I've heard of it. We actually came up with a name for something that we were trying to do. It's like, no, do you use ChatGPT every single day for what you're doing? It's a question I kind of posed at the beginning. And the answer was, no, how, right? Like, tell me how, where I'm the athletic director. Like, we practice passing balls better, or the basketball coach. And I said, all right, let's take the team. Let's go give the team stats for the current team. Let's enter that in the prompt and say, okay, here's the current team. Let's go take the 3 top-ranked teams in the division and ask it to go look at the 3 top-ranked teams of the division. And now tell me, what players do I need to recruit and why, based on those inputs, if I want to have a better record next year? And literally what it did, it said, okay, on average, you have, your guards are having more turnovers than the other team. This is, the top 2 teams have these percentages on 3 points that you don't need. You need a 3-point shooter. You need a guard that does this. And it came back with, okay, here's a recruiting plan. And if you want, the next prompt was, okay, help me write good, where should I go recruit? What are good recruiting letters? And that's an example of an athletic director at a college versus a teacher or student, but it is to say that literally anybody in the educational institution, administrator, I was talking to a COO, athletic director, anybody, not just the teachers and the students, should be using this on a daily basis to help them. A way to think about it, and a way that I think about it in talking to somebody else that, again, was in a college context, was think about it like having a think tank. And if you have a personal think tank, one of the things that I encourage, any problem that either one of you, anybody in the audience is facing, go to ChatGPT or go to Bing and anywhere where you experiment with this stuff, and ask it to come up, not with an answer, ask it to come up with 15 different answers to the same question. Because that's when you go those precious moments when we get to have an offsite and brainstorm and hear collaborative ideas from 15 different people. Or if you could afford a personal think tank where you can outsource a question to a strategy think group where they have 10 different people coming up with 10 different answers. Think about it coming up with, okay, I'm facing this problem. In this context, I was talking to somebody about putting together a budget and literally trying to figure out a budget given the cuts. And they entered the budget, they entered the cuts, they entered the priorities they had. And they said, give me 10 different options, some that are conservative, some that are optimistic, some that assume this, some that come at it from an administrative perspective, some that optimize for the family perspective. And all of a sudden, you have 10 or 15 advisors helping you versus thinking about the single question and answer that most of us, at least in the beginning, are doing with the system. So there are two examples just kind of from an education setting to give a sense, but maybe jumping into maybe workforce or other ones that you want to talk about.
Yeah, and I think what we're going to see is kind of to the think tank idea, there's going to be evolution of how you think about your task system. In some sense, how do you break down a workflow that you are used to is going to be very different. So think of one example I like to give is photo editing. Right now you have to go through this very complicated process of learning Photoshop, which is extremely overwhelming. 20 years in, I've not figured it out. But imagine there was a UI and I could give it text instructions, remove this extra person from the background, make the grass greener, fill in the patches in the grass, make the car redder, whatever it might be. And now, instead of having all these buttons, when I'm saying oh, I want to pick the color of the car, that's when I see the buttons because there's nuance there and I don't know how to put it in text. But we're going to see UI evolve into this kind of hybrid prompt with finer grain control. Volume is not great with text. I don't want to change volume using text. It's not a great UI. But for a lot of things where I could give a high level construct and achieve something, we're going to see a change in the user experience itself. And that's rethinking a lot of your workflows itself would force evolution there, which is oh, where can I generate options for myself? Where can I generate drafts for myself? So it's a lot of it is the first step in creation is having just extra creativity boost there.
Yeah. Common question that we get is around the limitations. And the limitations kind of span two different things. They span some of the technology, which I'd love for you to expand on, and then they span some of the psychology. And I think both cases are interesting. So if you start, Sourabh, with some of the technology limitations worth knowing.
So one of the most common limitations we hear about is hallucination. So kind of going back to how the model works is, let's say I asked, who's the president of United States? And on the internet, there are articles that were written at various points in time where the presidents were different. So in some sense, it doesn't it's oh, maybe there were 100 more articles written on who's the president of United States around Barack Obama. And then a new president just doesn't have that many articles written. So it's very likely to predict Barack Obama or any other president. So now that's hallucinating because that's not a fact. That's changes there and some human needs to curate. That leads because of one, it doesn't have recent data. So it was trained at some point in time. So the world has changed beyond that. So if you were asking questions around tax regulation or legal advice, recency matters a lot because the world might have evolved. So, or the other thing that happens is if I was writing an article, say explaining something, and there are different theories that are evolved on the internet, it might predict the wrong next word. So there you're saying it's saying incorrect things, and that's hallucinating. And those are limitations, but this is an active area of research. We're actively working on it. And you could imagine a hybrid system where there's foundational knowledge, but recency correctness or a fact-checking model, things like that we build on top that kind of merge the two and get us to a better answer or a better place. But those are all research areas.
And I think the key here, whether that or the math problems that it isn't good at, as I said, that's all going to get solved. I think the harder problem, we're going to transition a little bit before we open up to Q&A, the harder problem is the psychology and the people change and process change. And I'm going to start by talking about equity as a problem, which is clearly a priority for all of us in the education space, and actually maybe give a bit of a different angle than what folks have thought about. You may or may not have heard that these things cost a lot to go run as far as kind of the cloud services behind them and the processing power necessary behind them. And one of the concerns that I'm going to have as far as what are the limitations of these models is actually being able to deploy them at scale with equity in the education environment. And I'm going to pose it as a problem versus have a solution for it. The technology, I think, is going to solve. Are prices going to go down? Yes, they will. But one of the ways that prices will go down over time is we're going to move a lot of the heavy compute power that currently happens on Microsoft's cloud and Amazon's cloud and Google's cloud. That's going to move down to the client computers because that's the only way to offset the price. And if over the last decade, the education industry has done a decent and a good job, not a perfect job and not done, but a good job getting devices far more equitably spread because you can buy a $200 Chromebook or Windows PC and get it into the hands of students. When all of a sudden compute power is actually going to be a premium again, and you wanting to run these models are going to need an expensive machine, we're going to see a flow back in the other direction. And that's going to be a problem that we need to solve as an industry. And I'm not sitting here with a solution, but bringing up equity, that's one angle of the equity problem. I'll give you another one, again, like there's no perfect answers. We're all learning here. There's a student safety problem. Again, the ed tech world has spent a lot of time thinking about student safety. There are many products out there and vendors out here that focus on filtering out bad words, filtering out self-harm, identifying when a student enters self-harm words and figuring that out, or images and things of the sort. To date, none of that has been focused on filtering out what the computer software does, because the user experience was predetermined. Everybody knew it was safe. And all of a sudden, there's another actor in the conversation. And a conversation I had with a school leadership team just a few weeks back was, what do we do if students are using this, because we want to be forward-looking and let them use this, and all of a sudden it comes into a corner where it's bullying the students. And it can bully the students. Like, how do we report that? What do we do with that? How do we know that we're staying safe? And there isn't a technical answer. There are safeguards that OpenAI are putting in place on top and other vendors are. But again, early days, because that's not what that's not how the software was designed originally. And is a concern and something that will be a limitation. And then probably kind of the biggest one is the limitation around changing processes in people. And the example, like I think at this point, everybody in the room has seen the calculator example as an example. And I like bringing it up, whenever I talk to any school leader and any educator here in the room, it is largely true, and in my role at Microsoft, I got to see education, K through 12 and higher ed across the world. It is largely true that no institution at scale allows use of Google and laptops during test taking, definitely not high stakes test taking. No institution at scale, and that's been around for 20 years plus. No institution at scale allows use of the phone throughout test taking. That's been around for smartphones for 10 years. And no institution at scale during test taking, just as to pick a point and and kind of individual exams and what have you, high stake exams, lets kids collaborate on their answers. And kids have been with other kids in school for much longer than 20 years. And we haven't figured that out. Whereas if you stop and think about your day job, any moment of your day job, you are using the web, you are using your phone, and you are talking to your colleagues and collaborating. And that so anybody that tells me, oh, we're all in on adopting ChatGPT into our school system, like, okay, let me tell me, how are you doing on allowing kids to collaborate, use their phones, call anybody, open web on all their tests? Oh, no, we don't do that. It's not allowed. Like, okay, you haven't convinced me that you're really willing to change the systems and the constraints around. And whatever the underlying reasons, whether it is fear of plagiarism, whether it's I don't know how to explain how this thing works, whatever it might be, it's those processes that exist that are going to limit the value of the technology. Another version of that, if I stop and think about literally the transformation from paper to digital, the fact that kids we should do whatever they're doing. I don't know what they're doing, but if you could jump real quick, find out what they said, come back. But the fact that kids do their homework on a Chromebook or Windows device, it doesn't matter, Google Docs, Word, turn it in, and a teacher grades it over the weekend, they get it back next Tuesday, they're already learning whatever the next stage of the lesson. The fact that you're not getting different results than when you were doing it on paper, why would you? The process hasn't changed. And again, kind of the call to action here is to examine not what the technology limitations are. Those will get resolved. It is to examine what are the process changes that you need to apply within your education system, within your company. If you're looking at this from a chief learning officer perspective, if you're looking at this from an ISV or a publisher perspective, like a conversation that we had, what do you need to change in the process of how things happen and how decisions happen and how work happens in order to enable for this to be effective? So the last kind of time that we planned on spending together, so you should tell me if you want to weigh in with anything else kind of on the limitations.
I think
open it up predominantly to Q&A. I think the last thought, and then with 15 minutes left, which I think was our plan, open it up to questions. Kind of the last thought to leave folks with is really kind of back to the top. Like you should be using it every single day. And just stop and think. Like, and I'll tell you my personal trick. I pinned both Bing and ChatGPT to my start menu. They are there. I have an open window. I don't move on a decision or something I'm creating without seeing what it comes up with. And seeing what it comes up with in multiple variables. And just get into the habit. Because you have somebody to think with you. You have somebody to think more broadly than you can and bring more creativity to the problem. Don't worry about the limitations. Don't try to find, how to limit plagiarism. All that stuff, like, don't explain why it doesn't work. Let us, on the tech side, let the big companies figure that. It will be figured out sooner than not. But go spend the time on the human change that needs to happen and the process change that needs to happen in order to allow it to come into whatever you are doing. So I'm going to pause there with 14:40 or so, 15 left to go, and open it up to Q&A. There are no mics. It's a small room. Anything and everything is fair game. You were first in the back, at least that I saw, so please. Yeah, and I'm going to summarize the question real quick, which is kind of what do we suggest to do to reduce the fear, to get ahead of the policy, trying to figure out what to do, potentially blocking it already or not. And I think the first thing, and this is something that I think is true for, and one of the reasons that I think it's valuable to go use it every single day. And everybody, like get the COOs, get the superintendent, like get everybody using it every single day, because self-education is like and familiarization reduces the fear factor. And that's part one in kind of in doing this. Part two, from a teacher perspective, and this is super hard. And again, it's even harder with ChatGPT, but it's been hard with technology. And I recognize that what I'm going to say sounds easy, but it's hard to actually go do, because humans are part of the problem, and it's hard to change human nature. But it is having everybody, the leaders, starting from the leadership on all the way down to the classroom, model the growth mindset that is, we're going to learn together with you. Like, we want to preach that we're trying to model learning and create a learning environment. Well, then it's okay to not know how this thing works. And it's okay to not fully understand whether it's right or wrong, but let's go learn together and experiment together. Both at the administrative level and then at the teaching and learning level. And I think that more than anything, the hands-on experience, where I've seen transformation happen effectively, is when the leadership has the hands-on experience and isn't just talking about it at the buzz level or at the sort of blocking and tackling because, oh, we heard that's them plagiarize, or oh, we heard this. If they start using it in a way that changes their behaviors, it will both demystify but also inspire them to figure out how to change behaviors quicker. But I recognize that as an easy answer and a hard, long road to implement for sure. Go ahead, please.
I'm at Western Governors University, and I'm trying to use ChatGPT to help underrepresented minorities to learn computer science and software engineering, and so that they can get past the friction points that are there, because they self-select out, they don't get in, and they get in, they don't do as well. If you surround them with people, they succeed, but that's too expensive. So the question is, can we use ChatGPT and our instructors, which we have a really good model with instructors to do that? Do you have any thoughts on that?
It's a great question. And first of all, thank you for trying to do what you're doing. It's super important, which is supporting underrepresented minorities and learning computer science. I'm going to use, you should weigh in if you have thoughts. Because I'm going to use your question to answer a different one in a second, but you should start.
I can take this one. So Corise is like a adult education company. We work with adults to pivot to an adjacent career or level up in their career. And this is a problem we struggle with in some sense. This is if we had one-on-one personalized tutoring, there are higher outcomes. If we have one size fits all, there's challenges there and outcomes suffer. And can we leverage AI to make this much more affordable? And this is like exactly the problem we have tackled, which is like now, like with this technology, it is possible to give you the best hint possible at when you need it. Like we can see what you attempted, we can see what you tried. You can ask it questions without like in a psychological safe manner, without feeling like fear of like what would your classmates think, what would other people think. You can like think of it as like I asked you a question, and you could have said like, oh, if people they make this mistake, give them this hint. If people make this mistake, that was so cumbersome to enumerate every possible situation that could happen. But with these models, you can just say like, okay, here's what the student is trying to do. Here's the goal. What is the best like learning trajectory for them at that moment? And we've seen like pretty good success there. So that is definitely an area where like these models help a lot with like helping people unstuck before they drop out, helping them get the perfect hint when they need it, helping them like think about like motivational messages, like surfacing to the instructor of like what is the escalation path. And I think what I personally believe is like you need this tandem of like what can the AI answer, but always allow for like escalation paths to be able to talk to a human and like be able to like go to a human, because teaching is as much about like academic content as it is about like motivating and influencing.
And I think the term that you'll hear and probably heard and read a lot about is co-pilot is a term that is used. And thinking about this as a boost for the tutors and instructors that you do have, right? Like how can an instructor that maybe can scale today to 10 students, I'm inventing, to 10 students today, how can they use this to take the inputs from 100 students and the questions that they have, and have it create personalized learning plans for 100 students that they just need to quickly look at and maybe add a little bit more to. And then it becomes a lot of the talk is about how does it help students learn. Think about how it boosts and becomes an amplifier to the instructor in that co-pilot sense.
Yeah, like one example there is like, we've all been in this situation where the questions that come up are consistently similar. Where like, how can we like leverage the knowledge that we have already created to like supercharge teaching or tutoring is like an open area where like there's like a lot of possibilities where like, yes, there is something to getting an answer from a human, but there is also like people find it fearful. So there's like, how do we build a model that works for everybody?
Right. You're chomping at the bit by the door there, so go. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, so the question is around privacy, and I think kind of like student safety, it's still an area that's being developed from a technology perspective. And what are the right models, and in this context, some of the ways that some of the things that need to change, not just the underlying architecture that allows for just GDPR and the privacy that kind of is the lay of the land, but also how do you educate students on what do and don't they share and spend time with the models. And it goes back to kind of a fundamental thing where actually a lot of the discovery of what the challenges are is going to come from trial and error here. And having the teachers or having whoever, or whether it's teacher instructors or academic, sitting with and trying and seeing what comes up as a way to discover the edges and discover the limitations and see, okay, you're doing something which you shouldn't do. The books haven't been written on it yet, right? And the pedagogy hasn't been written on it yet. And I think that trial and error in the classroom to go discover it needs to happen. There are tools coming out that, again, place the appropriate filters, place the appropriate solutions. So I think to some degree the ed tech world is catching up with what is possible, and you'll see solutions come into the market
I think
as well.
Long term, we're going to see it play out similar to like an email. Like your email has a ton of private information, but there's like assumed safety and guardrails around it. And you can imagine your personal think tank would be like your email is similar to the conversation log you have. And like that is like a analogy that I think like the systems would evolve towards.
Your sports example you gave where you uploaded
Yeah.
statistics. Okay, so you uploaded, is that public now? Like if we uploaded all the student grades and everything in there and asked you to do it.
Yeah, it depends.
All parents going to come out and say, oh my God, it's just public. Yeah.
Great question, and the answer is, in my context, I just literally took the NCAA link. So I would not upload right now personal information that is behind and that's a great question, thank you. So no, I did not take anything. I took only public things and put it up there. And I think that's an important distinction right now. Because the models, I mean, if you go read the fine print right now, the models are looking at your inputs. That's true, and going into a public, a large cloud, not necessarily using them per se, but also the safeguards aren't there.
Yeah, and I think OpenAI did make a change
Yeah.
around, like, they don't use your conversations to train newer models. So they're also trying to actively make policy changes around it.
There's a question here, yeah.
Yeah, so the process change you're suggesting we work on. And I'm fascinated that you helped this basketball coach. I'm assuming he knew more than you did. But you helped him.
Yep.
So I'm wondering what your skill set was, and I'm going to guess is asking questions.
Okay.
And so the process change I'm thinking about is, would you recommend that we learn to teach, go back to Socrates, that we completely reconfigure the role of a teacher from giving answers for a lot of their time to teaching students how to ask questions?
Can I take a slight pivot on it? I love where you're going and agree with everything you're saying, and I'm going to expand a little bit, which is I think the role teachers really should have, and I think this relates to this, is teach kids how to learn. And how to learn new things assumes you don't know, like back to, I don't know as much about basketball as the basketball coach that I talk to is a true statement, no matter what I think, by the way, but that's, and I think that it starts, and I'm a big believer in kind of the growth mindset it starts from being willing to be a learner versus a know-it-all. It starts from having the growth mindset to have the curiosity and willingness to go, I don't know, let me ask. But I think that asking, it's a bit broader than asking. It's fundamentally, because Socrates asked to some degree from a point of knowledge too. It's being willing to admit that you don't know the answer and having the curiosity and growth mindset to go learn something new. That's all I had. There's like, I don't know, let's try. And I think, frankly, students start with the I don't know, let's try, and that gets often beaten out of them over years, unfortunately, until you're supposed to know, as opposed to the open, you don't know. So I think it's a combination of asking questions, but not just asking, it's the willingness to start from a place of wanting to learn.
I think it goes back to like what Eran's been saying, which is like, one, we need to like kind of like rise the tide on how much do we understand what is going on, because it is very easy to like buzzword claim like any side of the spectrum as everything's good or everything's bad. But I think we need to learn nuance of like what is like possible today, what is changing, what do we want to work on, what do we not want to work on. And I think in some sense like people understanding how these models work, what are capabilities, what in your process can you try to impact, I think is just super important. So I think it's like the first layer of like, I think change is that like, how do we educate everybody to like a higher bar so that like, and this is important for like our students who are coming in to have like crazy amount of digital acumen. Like my nephews and nieces are way better at using, like they try to swipe the TV and they get mad that the TV doesn't swipe. So.
And I don't have, to some degree, I don't have an answer to your question, like honestly, a good answer to your question. And one, I'd encourage you afterwards, like we had some conversations around this before, like that's a lot of people in this conference, that's what they're trying to figure out. And I think it is figuring it out and creating it collectively. And having that conversation. But it's also a good example of literally what I'm, go to ChatGPT or go to Bing and say, okay, I want 10 different answers on how to approach this, assuming the following constraints or the following, and I want it to come from, and see what it comes out with. Because I do think it's a creative process of discovery of what the answer is. I don't have a good answer. Where I've seen it done successfully, it is the usual change management of, it's education, it's celebrating successes, it's pointing at where change happens. But those are, again, I consider those the obvious, and yet the reality is so much harder than the obvious, I admit. I'll take I think one or two more, but go ahead, yes, please. Both of you, pick who's first. That's a great question. Are there example schools? At least what I've seen is there are phenomenal individual teachers. I haven't seen a school or a university, like I haven't seen at scale yet because we're early and because of all the reasons that they're giving away prizes. It's knives, it's, I don't know what
There's
it
free
is.
Bitcoin there for sure.
We're gonna, at the end, the only thing I care about is louder than them. And if that wasn't asked for, it would have been good. I'm happy to figure, like I have no idea how to communicate with everybody here, but I will stay afterwards. I follow a lot of, whether Twitter, LinkedIn, pick whatever, I follow a lot of individual teachers breaking ground with remarkable things. I have yet to see at scale, because we're early, whole school systems or whole buildings doing something, and maybe they exist, but definitely teachers, and I'm happy afterwards to share some links. And you had a question in the back. I think we're gonna finish. Was there one more behind you or no? No, we're good? You'll take it? You'll take her question just like that? You two should, go ahead. We'll wrap up with that one.
Yeah, I'm gonna go back to a technology comment you made.
Yeah.
When you were talking about scalability, I just want to make sure that I heard you correctly in reference to, you were talking about Chromebook, and then we're going to have to put the power
Yeah.
to, I'll call it a personal device or a laptop.
Yeah.
Talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah.
Cloud is not going to be powerful enough to manage it.
I think the limitation, at the end of the day, the most likely, I can't tell you for sure, but the most likely architecture that will come out to resolve kind of the fact that there's just so much data center space, so many GPUs that the large companies can buy, and it's just going to be constrained ahead of demand for a long time. Both from a cost perspective, but also from a constraint perspective, they're obviously connected. The architecture is going to be go move a bunch of the compute power back to the client. And frankly, the computer industry has been doing that sine wave forever. And that's going to happen. And that's going to require GPUs and NPUs at the client. So yes. I'm going to leave everybody with one last thought, and we're being cut off, which is, first of all, thank you. But second of all, I'm quoting a bunch of different people on this. The best analogy I've heard for this technology so far is think about it like electricity, which is something that we cannot live without anymore. It has its dangers, for sure, but it transformed every industry. And that's not my quote, but I think that is how fundamental the change is, and worthwhile to just kind of think about how it transforms what you do. All right, folks, we are being called out. Thank you.
Thank you.